We also are going to ask if you're leaving, especially if you're leaving early, but for everyone, we do have a feedback survey for you to fill out and to let us know how we can improve the seminar and what we're doing well. One of the moderators will probably occasionally put the link, there it is, there it is in chat. If you need to leave early, we ask that maybe you take some time either before you leave or after you leave to fill out the survey. It would help us to make this workshop better. Okay, I'm going to go to the web page. In the email that I sent all of you, I sent you the link to this web page. Let me share screens. Okay, so this is the web page that I linked to, and it has the same installation information that I put in the email that I sent you. It also has the 3 practice files that I sent you, and I apologize. The last file, the Texas Housing Sales file, it needed to have a revision, so I sent most of you a new version of that file today. And so hopefully you got that email with the revised files. If you signed up since Friday, you got the 3 files with the announcement of the seminar. So everybody who got an email today with this file, this should have gotten the most current version of this Texas Housing Sales file, and I apologize about that. Some of the other R packages that are using this seminar, their coding has changed in the meantime since I gave this seminar last year, so I had to fix that over the weekend, and I apologize for not catching that earlier. Okay, this seminar is meant to be interactive in the sense that I'm going to be coding with you in R Studio specifically, and I'm going to give you time to code it yourself. A lot of it may be actually copy and paste. So it's helpful if you actually have the seminar open on your computer in addition to R Studio. Now, of course, you know, interacting with me or coding along with me is purely optional. So if you want to sit back, relax, and just watch, you'll probably get almost as much out of it as long as you're paying close attention. But for those of you that want to participate and want to sit down and code, that's the purpose of this seminar. So we'll leave as much time, hopefully enough time for you to follow along with me. Okay. Make sure you have RStudio. Go ahead and open it. If you haven't already, let's have it open. And then on the web page is the link to the seminar itself. So if you click on this link, R Markdown Basics seminar, it will bring up the seminar, which itself is a web page. It's an HTML file. It was actually created in R Markdown. So the slideshow that we're looking at is a product of R Markdown. And hopefully it will show you some of the power of what you can do with R Markdown. If you want to use this slideshow, and I do recommend you do have it open while we work, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you push the K key, because the K key will disable mouse clicking advance. So normally if you don't push the K key first, if you click on the mouse, it'll advance the slides. And that will make it a little difficult for you to copy and paste code from the slides into your R script. So instead, I'm going to recommend that you hit the K key, and then after you do that, once it says disabled mouse click advance, you can then copy and paste without worrying about it advancing the slide. Okay. Now this is a slideshow, so if you just hit left and right keys, or the, I think left and right and space, yes. Space will advance the slides. Okay. But if you prefer to actually look at it as just one gigantic web page, you can. If you hit the A key, that instead will flatten it out into one gigantic web page. And you can look at it either way. It has the exact same information. It's just one gigantic web page. I'm going to teach it through the slideshow, but you can view it however you like. Okay. All right, then I think we're ready to go. But before we begin, I'm actually going to start with a poll just to see where you all are already. So it's just going to ask you about your experience with R and R Markdown in the past. So if you wouldn't mind just responding to that really quick, it will help orient me. Okay, that's pretty good. It looks like most of you have responded. So most of you have a little bit or pretty good experience with R in the past. A few of you have never used R, and most of you have never used or only used R Markdown a little bit in the past. Okay, that's what I expected. The seminar doesn't really expect you to know really much of R Markdown at all, and only maybe a little bit of R. So those of you that have never used R before, you know, it may be a little difficult for you, but honestly, I think you'll be fine. So, okay, thank you for answering that. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let me share the screen again. Okay, so R Markdown Basics. Okay, so the seminar is aiming to teach you how to use R Markdown syntax to make beautiful, reproducible reports. So first, we're going to discuss what R Markdown is, then how it's used and how it works. The rest of the seminar focuses on the syntax of R Markdown. Specifically, the syntax we're going to be talking about are Markdown tags to format text, then knitr options to format R code and output, and then YAML coding to control the output document type and its appearance. And I know none of those terms may be familiar to you right now, but I promise you at the end of the seminar, you'll know what each of those three things are. The seminar is not going to try to explain all the R code that's used in the example report. So there's ggplot code, for instance. There's regression coding that's used in these R Markdown files. I'm not going to be explaining that. I'm going to be specifically focusing on the R Markdown aspects of it. So we just don't have time to do it, but you don't need to understand that code to understand R Markdown, fortunately. In this seminar, sometimes you'll see text that has this special typeface, like this, what I've highlighted right there. If it has sort of a gray background and that special typeface, that's usually some sort of coding syntax that you can use when you're writing an R Markdown file. And then also buttons and menus in RStudio will appear within that same typeface and background. Now, if you see a green block of text, that's going to be an instruction to modify an R Markdown file. So I'm going to give you some little bit of code there to put in your R Markdown file. And then when you're done with that, you're going to click the knit button after you've adjusted your R Markdown file. Okay, and then you can view the results of what we just did. So every time you see a green block, modify the code and then hit knit when you're done. And I'll explain what the knit button is. Okay, and then I already explained that you should go ahead and hit the K key so that when you click your mouse, it does not advance the slide. Okay, because some of the code we're going to copy is pretty lengthy, and so it will take you too long to type it. But I do want to show you what some of this coding does. All right, so it's in your best interest to not have mouse clicking advance the slide. Okay, so what is R? Well, R Markdown, according to its creators, is an authoring framework for data science. All right, so basically, R Markdown allows us to create reproducible documents that weave text and R code together and the output that the R code produces all into one document. Okay. For example, below this little piece of text I'm reading right now, there's an R code block. And you can see it's the bar plot code. And so in R Markdown, you can write the code, you can write all the text above. You can insert this R code that goes beneath it. And then when you knit the file, R Markdown will insert the graph right after the code, right? And so you have, as we said, text weave together with R code and then the output of that R code. And so that's what R Markdown allows us to do. Okay, so we highly recommend working with R Markdown and RStudio, which has many features which make working with R Markdown much easier. And this includes syntax highlighting. So the headers will be colored blue, for instance. Our code chunks will have a gray background. So it'll be in general easier for you to identify different parts of your R Markdown document in RStudio. It's easy to compile the R Markdown file. You just need to push a single button. You can run the code chunks individually without having to compile the whole file. You'll also get a preview of your document out of RStudio. And RStudio includes the document converter called pandoc, and we will discuss what pandoc is later. Okay, I believe R Markdown is actually installed with RStudio, so you don't usually have to install it separately, but if you have an old version of RStudio, you might need to, and if so, you can just run install up packages R Markdown. Okay, and again, if there's any questions at any point, you can either chime in by unmuting, or you can put it in chat, and then either Johnny or Siavash will answer you directly, or they'll maybe ask me to answer the question for everybody. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and jump in and work on our first R Markdown file. So what I want you to do is I want you to go into RStudio and go into the File menu, right? And we're gonna choose File, then New File, and then R Markdown. So let me go into RStudio. RStudio. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my RStudio. If not, do let me know immediately. So as I said, go to File, then New File, which is the first entry after File, and then R Markdown. Okay, like this. And then go ahead and click that when you see it. So once again, I'll just do that for everybody once again. So File, New File, R Markdown. Okay, it should bring up this new window. And in the title field, go ahead and just type practice. We're going to call this first file practice. It should already be highlighted document over here. If not, do make sure that document is highlighted over here. We want it to be HTML here. And hopefully your name is here. If not, you can go ahead and put it in there. Once you've done all that, just click OK. And it should bring up this R Markdown file right here. It's untitled at the moment. We will worry about that in a minute. Okay. Is anybody having trouble opening their first R Markdown file? If so, let me know now or let the moderators know in chat. Okay. So we can already see the three elements that I was talking about earlier in this file. The first thing is the YAML header at the top. And this basically controls the overall appearance of the document, what kind of document we're going to be making. So if we want to, for instance, make a slideshow, or we want to make a LaTeX document, we specify that here. The second part of an R Markdown file is Markdown. And so this little set of two hashtags, these two asterisks, these are all Markdown codes. And these Markdown codes tell R Markdown, how do I want to format this text? So for instance, this text R Markdown is going to be formatted as a header, and this text will be bolded. And then the third element of an R Markdown file is the R code chunk, which there's one right here, it's in gray, and there's another one here and another one at the bottom. All right. And so this is where you put your actual R code, and then R Markdown will insert the output of this R code after the R code itself. All right. So it'll stick in the output into the document for you. All right. And that's what makes R Markdown so nice, is that you can put all your notes and all your narrative in text, and then put the data analysis and the statistics and the results and the graphs in the R code chunks, which then R Markdown will process and put the output for you into the document. Okay, back to the slideshow. Let me go over, I kind of went over this already, but the YAML header, as I mentioned at the top, is delimited by those three tags. I'm sorry, those three dash symbols. So these symbols delineate the YAML header. And YAML stands for YAML ain't markup language, or yet another markup language. And it's supposedly a human readable language, which we use here to communicate with Pandoc. All right. Pandoc is a program that converts between document formats. So for instance, it can convert an HTML file to a LaTeX file, or a LaTeX file to a Word file, or a Word file to some other kind of file, like a slideshow. All right, so it can convert between documents. And Pandoc is installed with RStudio. And so we use the YAML header, the top part of the R Markdown document, to communicate with Pandoc so we can control the appearance of our document, right? So again, the YAML header is used to control which output format we're going to use, such as HTML, LaTeX PDF, the overall appearance of the document, such as the colors, the color scheme we're using, and whether or not, for instance, we want to add other files to add content or style the document. So if some of you are used to working with HTML and CSS, for instance, you can add your CSS files through the YAML header. It also contains the metadata about the document, such as the author, the title, and the date. Okay, but all of these things are optional actually. So you can basically put whatever you want in the YAML header. None of it is required, except for the output format. Okay, then as I mentioned, the Markdown is the second element. And those are the little special characters that are used to format the text in the document. Okay, and as I went over, those two little hashtags signify a section header, and like the double asterisk signify that we want to bold the text. Okay, and we're going to go over each one of these elements in much more detail in the remaining part of the seminar. Okay, Markdown is what we call a markup language, which is a system of code shortcuts used to annotate or format plain text. Okay, then once the RMD file is compiled, the text will actually be formatted according to whatever tags we use. Okay, and then finally, the final element is the R code chunks. Okay, as you notice, they're highlighted in gray, but there are special characters we use to delineate an R code chunk, and that is these three little backticks, and then this open curly brace. All right, so this is the top of an R code chunk, and then this is the bottom of an R code chunk, right? And again, we will go into much more detail how you specify each of these things in the rest of the seminar. The R code chunks are actually processed by a package called knitr. All right, so there's a separate package, but it's bundled with R Markdown, so it's installed with R Markdown. But knitr is actually what processes the code chunks and sticks in the output into the document. When the R Markdown file is compiled and rendered, the output of this code chunk will be embedded in the document underneath the code, which we discussed. Okay. R Markdown and knitr provides a large array of options to control the appearance of both the R code itself and its output, and we'll be discussing a lot of those options later. Okay, so once we're pleased with the contents of our R Markdown file, we can render it into its final output format in at least two different ways. And we're really just going to be using one way, and that is the knit button. Okay, and so if you look in R Studio, there's this button that has a little yarn and the sewing needle, and it's the knit button. And when you hit that knit button, R Studio will compile this R Markdown file, and it will create a preview for you, and will also save the output document to your hard drive. So yes, so let's go ahead and hit the knit button. All right, so go ahead and click on this button. What it will ask you to do is create a name for the file. So I'm just going to call mine practice and put it somewhere where you can find it. I'm going to put mine on my desktop. Okay, and then once you've saved it with some name, R Studio will process it, will render it, and you'll get a preview. Okay, and so this is the preview, and this is an HTML document. And so you can see, for instance, this is the metadata from the YAML header. You can see that the R Markdown became this nice big header. You can see our R code chunk here and the output here. Another output from a code chunk here. For some reason, the code didn't appear, and we'll discuss why the code didn't appear later on. You'll see the word knit has been bolded. Okay, so this is the YAML header. The fact that this is formatted and the fact that this is formatted is due to Markdown. And this is knitr and R code chunks here. So those are the three elements that we'll be discussing in more detail today, so that you can create the kind of document you want. Okay. Are there any questions so far about what we've gone over? We just provided an overview of an R Markdown file, its elements, and then finally how to actually render it. Oh, one thing I should mention is that wherever you save that file, so when you knitted it, it asks you to save it somewhere. I saved mine in a directory. So I saved mine in this R Markdown live directory. You'll see this new file here that's an HTML. By default, my computer opens HTML documents in Chrome, Google Chrome. So it is actually a web page. And if you double click it to open it, for instance, it will open in Chrome. All right. And so this is the true output of rendering it. This is the actual file it produces. What R Markdown shows you is a preview. Now the preview looks, for the most part, very similar, but sometimes it might look slightly different in some places. All right, but for the most part, it will look very, very similar. So usually you don't actually have to look at the file itself. You can just look at the preview. But just so you know, it is actually there. I need to fiddle with my controls. Okay. All right. Again, if there's any questions, please stop me or ask one of the moderators. Here we go. Okay. So let me try to explain now how this all works, kind of behind the scenes. So R Markdown is the unification of these three frameworks: Markdown to format the text, Knitr to process the R code chunks, and then Yaml or Pandoc to control what kind of output format we're going to get. When we render the document, the following happens. First, Knitr converts all of the R code chunks, code and output, both code and output, into text and Markdown tags. So Knitr takes those R code chunks and then translates it into text, but with Markdown tags to format it. Then there's already Markdown tags in other places. So the resulting file is basically what we call a Markdown file, meaning now there's no more R code chunks. They've been converted into text that it has been formatted, okay? But now you basically have a Markdown file, which is text with a bunch of tags to format it, okay? Then with the Markdown file, Pandoc takes the Markdown file and then converts it into the final desired output format, such as an HTML web page, or a LaTeX PDF document, or an IO slideshow presentation, for instance. So Pandoc takes this Markdown file and it can convert between different output formats. So it does the job of converting it to one of these formats. Okay. So thus, in order to use R Markdown proficiently, we have to learn a little bit about each of these coding frameworks. We have to learn a little Markdown, a little Knitr, and a little YAML. Okay. Fortunately, the creators of R Markdown have done a lot of the work for you up front by setting a lot of the options to have really smart defaults. Like for instance, if you're creating a slideshow, by default, it'll make the font size really large. But if you're making a LaTeX PDF document, it'll make the default font size much smaller. So it tries to do a lot of the work for you so that you don't have to specify every little detail about your document. And furthermore, none of the coding really is that difficult, to be honest. But if you really want to have really fine control about where everything on your document is placed and how it all looks, you might need to learn some more advanced coding like HTML itself or LaTeX or CSS, for instance. Okay, but what we'll teach you today will get you pretty far. R Markdown keeps it simple for the user by requiring this single format, the R Markdown file, to produce a whole wide array of different output formats, right? And that's the beauty of R Markdown, is that you just need to learn this one overall framework, and then you can get all different kinds of files, output files that look really different. Okay, any questions about R Markdown overall before we jump into the individual elements? Any questions at all? Okay, then let's jump in. So we're going to start with Markdown. Okay, so to give you a little bit more background, let's talk about what a markup language is and what is HTML. So a markup language is a system of tags used to format documents. And tags are used to define sections, change the appearance of text, build tables, link images, and so on. Okay? Hypertext Markup Language, or HTML, is a markup language designed to be used for web pages. Okay? The placement and appearance of text, images, frames, tables, and all other elements can be specified in HTML. So if you open up just any old web page, like for instance, our stats web page, if you, for instance, view the page source, this is all HTML. So for instance, these little tags here tell how this text is going to, well, not necessarily this, how like this text is going to be formatted when you see it on the web page, all right? And so these tags right here with the little less than, greater than symbols. Those are codes to say how exactly you want to format the text. Okay. Yes, as I mentioned, they have these less than and greater than symbols, and then there's an opening tag and a closing tag. Okay, so for example, if you enclose text in these EM tags, right, EM and then /EM, it will italicize the text inside. So this HELLO becomes italicized hello when you view it in a web browser. Okay, so as you can see, HTML tags format text. Markdown does the same thing. Markdown is designed to be a lightweight markup language. And lightweight meaning that the tags that you use will be simpler and easier to type. So Markdown was actually originally designed to be a shorthand for HTML. All right, so for instance, we just learned that the EM tags in HTML will italicize text. In Markdown, you can just use stars. So you can see how it's more lightweight, it's simpler and easier to type. So again, originally, Markdown was shorthand for HTML, but with Pandoc, we can convert Markdown to a whole a large set of other output formats besides HTML. Okay. And Pandoc, again, is included with R Markdown, so this is the power that we get with R Markdown. Because of its simplicity, Markdown is very easy to use, so it's so easy to learn. We can learn a lot of it just today. Okay, so what I want you to do is in the R Markdown file we just opened here, I want you to delete everything except for the Yaml header at the top. So don't worry about the rest of it, just delete. Okay, we're going to just use the space underneath the Yaml header to practice, R Markdown. Okay. All right, so first is spacing in paragraphs. So new lines or carriage returns or hitting the enter key are considered spaces in R Markdown. Okay, and you'll see this. So first, we're going to try adding the following text broken by a single new line after the first period. So I have first period, new line, second period. So I'm going to type that. You can feel free to copy and paste this. So if you want to just copy and paste this directly in to the file, go ahead. That is totally fine. I'm actually going to type them to keep it to slow me down a little bit, so I make sure everybody is following in time. Okay, but you can feel free to copy and paste all you like. Once you've done that, I want you to hit knit, and then you'll see that new line is treated only as a space in R Markdown. Okay, or in Markdown, I should say. So how do we then start a new paragraph? Well, there are two ways. One way is you do two new lines. All right, so now go back to where we were before and just add another new line. So hit enter again. Once you do that, go ahead and hit the knit button again, and you'll see now we've started a new paragraph. Okay, so you need at least two new lines to start a new paragraph, or you can do it a different way. The other way is that before typing the new line, you add two spaces before it. So it's space, space, and then new line. Okay, so let me show you that. So going back to where we were before, this is just the new line between these two lines. If I do space, space, then that will produce a new paragraph. Okay, so the space, space, new line is the same as two new lines, according to Markdown. Okay, easy. Headers, as I mentioned before, those hashtag or pound symbols are used as header tags, and you can have 1 to 6 of them. So the number of hashtag signs indicates the level of the header that you want to create. So one hashtag will be a very large, big header, and then as you add more, they become smaller and smaller. Okay, so what I want you to do is in the R Markdown file, add 2 headers. Add a level 1 header called a big header, and then a level 3 header called small header. All right, so anywhere you like, but I'm going to put mine here. So I'm going to add a level 1 header, which means just one hashtag, and make sure there's a space between the hashtag and the text. Okay. And then I'll add another one that's a small header. Let me separate these a little more. Okay. Once you've entered those two, you can hit knit again. I'll give everybody a couple more seconds. If I'm going too fast, please do let me or the moderators know, and I'll try to slow down. So as you can see, big header is in a slightly larger font than small header. Okay, and we can, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to do 3. Oops, sorry. If I had done 3, it would be even smaller. There we go, even smaller. Okay, and again, you can have up to 6 of these. Another nice thing that we'll learn later is that these headers can be used to initiate a new slide if you want to make a slideshow. Okay, so actually formatting inline text there's a bunch of options you can use. A single asterisk is used for italics. 2 asterisks is used for bold. The doubles, tildes, 2 tildes are used for strike through. And then you have the backticks, which are used for code. So whenever you see that gray background and this typeface, those are actually code tags that I use. All right, and again, I use these little backticks. If you want a superscript, you use caret. And if you want to subscript, you use a single tilde. So when you're using these tags, though, do not insert spaces in between the formatting tags and the text. Okay, do not insert spaces. Now, let's say, though, you actually want an asterisk to appear in the text. If you want that, you use a backslash before the character that you want to be treated as a literal character and not a tag. Okay, so if I do backslash star italics backslash star, it will actually print out the stars and it will not italicize italics. Okay, so the backslash treats the next character as a little character and not as a tag. Okay, I'm going to give you a little challenge now. I want you to try your best to figure out how to write this formatted text in Markdown. Okay, so we have we multiplied, which is italicized, bold x by z squared, which is bolded, to create the interaction variable x star z squared, which is also bolded. All right, I'll give you 1 minute, and if you can't get it, that's okay. We're going to go over it together after 1 minute. All right, so go ahead and try that on your own, and we'll come back in just a minute to do it together. All right, 20 more seconds, let's say. Okay, it's okay if you didn't get it. If you did, great. I'm going to do it together with you now. Okay, so obviously the regular text is no challenge. You just type it as is. So we, oops, I have captions down. We multiply is italicized, so we use a single asterisk, a single star to format that. X is bolded, so we need 2 stars for that. Fine, and then z squared, we want to bold it, so we're going to use 2 stars. And then the power 2, we're going to use carets to format that square. And then to create the interaction, oops, sorry, spelling variable, Now, this one's a little trickier, right? We want X star Z square all bolded. So we put X, the 2 asterisks to bold it, and then we put X. For the star, we need to treat it as a literal. So we need to put / star, and then Z squared again, which is Z caret 2 caret, and then star to bold it. Okay, and then you can always see the results of your formatting here, and that looks correct. Okay, any questions on that R Markdown syntax? Okay, I'm going to keep moving on then. Bulleted lists are easy to create in Markdown. To create a list, you just precede each item in the list with a star. You can actually also use a plus or a minus, and then a space, and then the text. Okay, so for instance, star space item 1, star space item 2 will create a list with 2 items. You can also add sublists. So for instance, if I want to have a list nested inside of another list, then I indent the sublist by 4 spaces first. All right, so you can see it on the page how the pluses here have been indented 4 spaces. If you want a numbered list, you can actually just use numbers themselves, like this, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'm just gonna ask you to practice this yourself right now. Just go ahead and try adding a bulleted list. So I'm just gonna say, here's item 1, okay? And then if you want to add a sublist, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then space item 2. So let's say sub 2. Let's call it sub 1 and sub 2. I'm just creating names. It can be whatever you want. And then, for instance, item 2. Okay. And let's see what this looks like. So here we can see we have our nice bulleted list right here, right? With the 2 sub items indented even more. All right. Very easy to create such a list in Markdown. And I can tell you it's a lot more trouble to create this directly in HTML. So Markdown makes it so much easier. Okay. Links. Okay, so you can link images, you can create links to web pages, and you can link to other parts of the same document. I'm really today only going to be talking about linking to an external web page. Okay, but if you want to know how to link inside the document to another location, you can read the other part of this slide today, but it takes a little too long to discuss that. So I'm just going to talking about the external link to a web page. So the basic tag for a link is the square brackets. Okay. What you do is you put the text you want to appear as the link inside the brackets. Okay. So for instance, here I've created the link for UCLA, for ucla.edu, but the text I want to appear as the link goes inside the brackets. So this UCLA goes inside the brackets. Okay. Then after you put in parentheses the location that you want it to go to. Okay. So let's try this ourselves. We're going to create a link that displays IDRI website. And then when you click on that link, I'm sorry, in bold, IDRI website in bold. And then we want to send the user, when they click that link, to our home web page, my group's home website web page, which is right here. So go ahead and copy and paste this, or copy it, and then paste it into our Markdown. So we want to create a link, okay? We'll discuss that in a second. Go ahead and put the parentheses. So you're going to have the square brackets for the text of the link, and then the location that the link sends them to goes inside parentheses. So if you copy that web address, go ahead and paste it. I'm sorry, but not with a period, not with a period at the end. Just like this, paste that into the parentheses. And then I said, create a link that says IDRI website in bold. All right, so you can put Markdown tags inside of the brackets to format them. Okay, so, and then when you knit that, you get this bolded link, and when you click on it, it will actually take you to a website. Okay, so that's a very easy way to create a link to an external web page. All right, so square brackets for the text, location in the parentheses. As I mentioned, if you want to learn, you can also, for instance, create a link to another part of the document. So for instance, if I wanted a link at the top that takes you to a section way at the bottom, this section right here will tell you how to do that. Okay, but I'm not going to go over that today because of time. You can also use this to link external images. Okay, so the syntax is slightly different because you put this exclamation point at the beginning. Then inside the brackets, you put the caption that you want to appear underneath the image. And then you put the location of the image on your computer inside the parentheses, but not in quotes. Do not put it in quotes because it won't work. Okay. So for instance, if there's a file that's called densities.png, if there's an image file called densities.png in the same directory as the RMD file, I can just do this. I can put the name of the image here, and then the caption goes here. Okay, but the exclamation point is used for an image link. And then that embeds it directly into the document with the caption that I said right there. Okay, we're not going to practice this because I didn't give you an image file, but if you want to know how to do it, it's very easy. Just remember you'll need this exclamation point, and remember that you don't put this in quotes. Notice that I did not put the name of the file or its path or anything in quotes. Okay. I'm going to just quickly mention, I'm not going to go over this slide in detail, but it's there for those who want to know. Some of you may have used tech math in like LaTeX or MathJax, you might have used it. They're all very similar ways of creating really nice looking mathematical equations. If you want to do that, use the $ symbols for inline tech math. And if you want mathematical equations that are centered, you use double $. Okay, but I don't want to go through and take the time to explain all of this tech coding. So I'm just going to leave this slide for those who are interested that you can put this math directly into your R Markdown document too. Okay. Okay, are there any questions about the Markdown section of this seminar? I know it's pretty simple, so maybe it's pretty easy, but if there's anything you have questions about before we move on to R coding, please ask me.
So the density map was inside, like in the same location as your R Markdown. If it's not, do you just have to put the full directory?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, but don't put it in quotes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But yes, if we're like at C:, documents, blah, 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 put all that first, yes. But just because it was in the same directory as the R Markdown file, in this case, I did not have to put that. Okay, good question. Any other questions? All right, let's move on to R code chunks then. Okay, so the R package knitter was actually conceived before R Markdown. And back then, it was used to basically weave text and R together into reports. R Markdown allows us to convert those reports into many different output formats. But already with knitter, we can put text and R code and output all together into one document. R code is placed in these code chunks that can be interleaved with the text of the document. All of the code chunks execute sequentially in one session when the RMD file is rendered. So objects created in one chunk are available to all subsequent chunks, right? So if you create like a data set, a data frame object in a previous chunk, you can use it in later chunks, okay? A large array of knitter options allows some control over the appearance of R code, text, and graphical output in the final document. So this is the link created. This link was created just with that syntax, those square brackets that I showed you before. And it takes you to the knitter help page. And these are all the options that you can use in these R code chunks to control how the R code looks and how the output looks. And as you can see, there are quite a few options to go through. So I'm certainly not going to go through even half of these, just a small portion I'm going to mention today, so you get an idea of the kinds of things you can do with these knitter options. Okay. All right, so for this section, I want you to open the first practice file I sent you, which is called sleepstudy.rmd. Okay, you can just close the other file, the practice file that we've been using. Okay, but I want you to find that file I sent you called sleepstudy.rmd. Okay, I'll give everybody a minute to open that. Okay, so now that you have that open, so how do we start in our code chunk? Okay, so as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the R code chunk itself was delimited by those 3 backticks, then some curly braces, which have some information inside. That's the top of the R code chunk. The bottom of the R code chunk is the 3 backticks again. Okay, and then everything inside is R code. Here I showed you, you do need to put the letter R after the curly brace. All right, so it's backtick, 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 curly brace, R, space. Then this is a label, so you can call each of your R code chunks. You can give them all a name, but it's optional. And then there are the options that I just mentioned to control the appearance of the R code in the output that you put after the chunk label, and you separate all the options with commas. Okay, and we will practice this more, so it'll become clear. You can type out the tag, but actually it takes a little effort to type out these things. So instead, I recommend that you learn one of the shortcuts. And there are 2 shortcuts you can use. One is the keyboard shortcut, and one is the button. The keyboard shortcut is Control-Alt-I or Command-Option-I on a Mac. And the other way to quickly insert is to use the Insert Code button. And depending on which version of RStudio you have, it always looks like this button, like this green button with a C and then a little green plus. It always looks like that. But some versions of RStudio have the word insert by this, and newer versions do not have the word insert. So this should be the newest version of RStudio, and you'll notice that there is no word insert. But some of you might see the word insert here. So either way, it's the same thing. Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to add an R code chunk using either this keyboard shortcut or using the insert button to insert an R code chunk after the text, here are the data in the R Markdown file. So at around line 21, you should see something that says, here are the data. So let's say at line 23, I want you to use this button or use the keyboard shortcut. So I'll show you the button first. It's the first option that says R. That will insert the R code chunk for you. Okay. Again, another way to do that is just to do Control-Alt-I or Command-Option-I if you're on a Mac. Again, you could actually type this out if you want, but it's a little cumbersome actually to type it out. So I recommend you learn one of these 2. So either this button right here or Control-Alt-I. Okay. So that's putting in an R code chunk. So as many of you know, if you just write out the name of an object in R, it'll print the object to the screen. Instead, if you have an R Markdown file, it won't print it to the screen, it'll print it to the document. So inside of our new code chunk, the one we just put in there, I want you to add 2 lines of code. First is the name of the data set, which is sleep. And sleep is automatically installed with R, so you don't actually have to download or download the data set. It's already there. And then a summary of the data set using the summary function. All right, so you can, if you like, just copy and paste this in, into the R Markdown file that we've been working on, like this, okay? But I'm just gonna go ahead and type it so that I give the rest of you more time to do this. Okay, once you've done that, you can go ahead and hit knit, and let's see what happens. Okay, so this is our rendered preview of the document that we've just created. And what you'll see is the text, here are the data. Then you'll see the first line of the R code chunk, which is the name of the data set. which will just print it out. So this is just the printout of the data set itself. Okay. Then you'll see the next line of R code, which is a summary of sleep, and then you'll see its output. So by default, knitr in R Markdown will stick in the output of each line of R code directly underneath the R code that produced it. Okay, so it'll separate individual lines of R code with the output. We can control all of that. Okay, so the R code itself is displayed in a gray background. As you can, sorry, in the preview on the preview. So the R code itself is displayed in the background. The output is always delimited by these double hashtags. And the reason why is you can copy and paste this into an R file, and hashtags are comment symbols, so they won't interfere with anything if you copy and paste it, okay? But just look for output with these double hashtag symbols, okay? And again, as I mentioned, each line of R code is then followed immediately by its output. Yeah, but all of these three things, each of these three things can be adjusted with knitr options. So let's talk about those options. I already showed you that list of options. So to specify these knitr R code chunk options, after the R symbol in the top of the R code chunk tag, you're going to specify a chunk label name, a comma, and then a list of options separated by commas. Okay, and this whole thing is then going to be known as the chunk header, right? So this whole thing right here is a chunk header. All of the chunk options have to be specified on one line. So do not put any line breaks. You know, don't hit the enter key in between any code options. You just keep typing them to one really, really long line. You usually don't need that many options, but sometimes it can get pretty long. Avoid the use of characters besides alphabetic characters and the hyphen. So what I want you to do is I want you to change the first line of the R code chunk that we just put in to this. Okay, so it's probably easiest for you just to copy and paste it. So copy it without the period, make sure you don't get the period. And then just paste it over the top line of the R code chunk so it looks like this. Okay. So what we've done here is we've added a code chunk label, and we've added an option that's echo equals false. So let's see what happens when we knit this file. Okay. Two things I want to mention before I even look at the output is you'll notice in the console section of your Art Studio, there is an R Markdown tab. And you'll notice, you know, when you knit, this screen pops up and shows you the progress of the rendering. But one thing you'll notice is now this label appears here in the processing of the output. And what's useful about this is that, you know, eventually you're going to have more than one chunk, right? You're going to have a bunch of chunks. There's one chunk in here so far. You're going to have a bunch of code chunks. And it's code chunks is where the R Markdown file may fail because you've made a syntax error, let's say, in one of your R codings. Well, with the label, you can identify where the problem is, right? Because it'll, you know, each code chunk that is successfully processed, you'll see here. But then, for instance, if this is the last code chunk before it errors, oh, then you'll know the error is somewhere in this code chunk. So labels are useful to identify where problems are happening in your code file, among other things. There are other uses for them too, but that's one of the main uses for them. Okay. Okay, now let's look at the output. What happened? What's different about this output? What do you notice is different? Well, you'll notice that the R code doesn't appear anymore, right? We only get the output now. We don't see the sleep code or the summary sleep code. And that's what echo equals false does. Echo basically means print out the R code or not. True means print the R code, false means don't print the R code. Okay. Okay, so that's our first option. Let's learn a few more options. So a lot of times you're going to use echo equals false. For instance, if you want to give your document to somebody else to look at, but you don't want to necessarily show them all the R code that you use to create the document, right? So here I've listed a bunch of, not a bunch, 4 options. And inside the parentheses, I put the default for this option. So what it will naturally be set to if you don't specify. So for instance, echo is naturally set to true, meaning by default, R Markdown will print all the R code in your document. But you can control this with echo. That's echo. Then we have eval. Eval true means run the R code in this R code chunk. Eval false means don't run the code in this chunk yet. So if you're creating a document and you're not ready to run the code, you can just set eval equals false. And then it'll basically skip over that R code chunk. You can actually set it to a vector of numbers, and you can set, for instance, eval equals 1 to 3, and that means just run the first 3 lines of code in this code chunk. So you can be more specific about which lines you want it to evaluate. Include tells R Markdown whether to include the R code and the output in the document. Okay, so it differs from eval in that if include equals false, the R code is still run in the background, but it won't be printed to the document. Okay, so eval means run it or not, period. Include means run it, but then print the output or don't. Okay, and finally, there are different ways to print the results. Sorry, the default is called Markup, which says print the output with special formatting depending on the document type. There are other ways you can specify results. One is hide, which is suppress, printing, hold, which prints all of the output of the entire code chunk after all the R code, which is we're going to see in a second. Then as is, we'll print the raw results without any special formatting. So if your R code has nice formatting in it, if you type as is, it'll get rid of all that formatting. All right. All right. So we're going to try out a couple of these options right now. The first thing I want you to do is change echo equals false to eval equals false. So just go in there and change the word echo to eval. Okay. Once you've done that, hit knit. So we just changed the word echo to eval. And what happened? Well, we see the R code itself, but then no output. And in fact, it won't run actually the output here. So if you do something in this code chunk, and then you have a second code chunk, which depends on the results of the first code chunk, that won't work because eval equals false means literally do not run the code in this code chunk. Okay. The second change I want you to make is that now I want you to change eval equals false to results equals hold, and I put hold in single quotations. Okay, so change eval equals false to results equals hold in quotes. And now I don't know if you've noticed, but R Markdown, one of the nice things about R Markdown is it tries to help you. So here it knew that results is what I was going to try, and then it gives me the options here. And if I can use the tab key to choose one of those options. So another one of the really nice things about running R Markdown or editing an R Markdown file in RStudio. Okay, once you've typed result equals hold, go ahead and knit the document and let's observe the results. Well, it looks very similar to the first document, but what do you notice? The difference here is that the 2 R codes are now put together and their outputs are put together also, right? Previously, if you did not have results equals hold, it would have sleep, then its output, then summary sleep, and then its output. But now it has all the code together and all the output together. So that's how you can control that kind of behavior. All right, so hopefully you're getting an idea of what kinds of things you can control with these knitter options. Another thing you control is warnings and messages. And this is something you often don't want to show in your final document, right? When you're handing, if you're, let's say you're a grad student and you're making a report for the PI on the project, you probably don't want them to see all the different R warnings and messages. You probably want to suppress those, okay? So by default, these are set to true, meaning the messages and warnings will be printed to the document. So in order to get rid of that, we're going to set them to false. All right, so we're going to do this in a few steps. The first step I want you to do is to insert a new code chunk after the text, first log transforming the outcome extra was suggested. Okay, so let's go find that first. Okay, so on line 32 for me is this line, first log transforming the outcome extra was suggested. Okay, what I want you to do is then enter a new code chunk. Again, it's Control-Alt-I or Command-Option-I, or you can use the button here. Okay, then I want you to go back to the slides. Inside the new code chunk, specify these 2 lines of code, and I'm just going to recommend you copy and paste this here. Okay. So as it turns out, this code that we're putting in there is running a log on a variable, running the logarithm function, but we have some negative values or zeros in this variable. And so that normally would cause R to produce a warning message. Let's see what happens when we knit. Okay, so now we're going to the bottom of the document, and you'll see here is the warning that I'm talking about. We have negative numbers and you can't take the log of a negative number, so it produces these not a numbers. We don't want to see that. All right, so what do? We're going to use the chunk option warning to turn off that warning. And it's easy as you can think. It's just take warning equals false. All right. So I'm going to ask you to also add this chunk label called log transform, and then after that, put in the option warning equals false. Okay, so let's do that. So use commas to separate things. Okay, so R, and then we can call this one, I think I call it log transform. That's the name of the option. And then we're going to say warning equals false. Okay, I'll give you just a few seconds to type that in. Okay. The main thing you want to get in there is warning equals false. Then knit. Now the warning doesn't appear. And what it's very quick, but normally what it actually does is send the warning to the R Markdown. I think this is where we have a warning here. So instead of putting the warning into the document, it often puts the warnings then into the processing output here. Okay, but that is the way that you can turn off warnings through knitter options. Sometimes if it doesn't say the word warning and you get red text, it's actually a message. So in that case, you might need to set message equals false to get rid of all the extra text that you don't want. All right, so try warning equals false and message equals false. Any questions so far about knitter code chunk options? No? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
My question is, this is easy to go ahead and make the chunk options clear per chunk, but is there a way to put a global chunk to overwrite things? So let's say you
That's the next slide.
That's the next slide. Okay, never mind.
Yep. Great question. That is a very good question. So let's say you wanted to turn off all the R codings. You wanted echo equals false basically in every single R code chunk. Well, instead of having to put it in every chunk, there is a way to set it for all chunks. Okay, and usually we put these at the top of our R Markdown file because wherever we put this, it affects all subsequent chunks. So you don't have to put it at the beginning. If you wanted to, let's say, affect every chunk after the second one, you would put this global chunk section after the second chunk. So whatever we do here will affect all subsequent chunks. So I'm putting it at the very top, all right? And so we're going to be using this function called ops chunk and specifically set. And we're going to set those, and then whatever we put in there will affect every other chunk in the document that follows. Okay, so what I want you to do is I first want you to add a new code chunk right after the header, but before purpose, okay? So here, go ahead and put in a new R code chunk. All right. And a lot of, if you look at other people's R Markdown files, a lot of people just call this setup. Okay. That's not required at all, but it's just kind of a standard thing that people use to label this first chunk. Okay. Actually, I'm not going to put any options yet. Then we need the special function, and that is this knitter : ops chunks $set. All right. So just go ahead and copy this whole thing and put it directly into the chunk, not into the chunk header, but actually into the chunk like this. Okay. And so what this means is that every chunk after this one will have echo set to false. Okay. So let's see. Let's go ahead and knit that. Now, as you can see, none of my R coding chunks have their R code output. In other words, echo has been set to false for each of these two, although the code chunk itself at the top does have its R code being printed. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. But again, if I put this, instead of at the very top, I put it between the other two chunks, let's say here, you'll see that it still prints out the code for the first chunk, but then doesn't print out the code for the second chunk. So it affects all subsequent chunks afterward. So if you do want it to be truly global, just put it before the very first chunk somewhere. Okay? But as I said, in the output, oh, sorry, let me reknit this. I moved it. In the output, this itself appears. And again, this may not be something your PI is going to say, what is this at the top, right? Well, how do we set that to go away? What do we do there? Well, you need to set echo equals false in the chunk header of this specific chunk, like this. All right. And then after I do that, now no code of any kind will appear anywhere in this document, right? Because I set echo equals false for every single R code chunk. Okay. So yes, this is a very, very useful thing to do. If you know you want to specify one or several things for every single code chunk, this is the way to do it. Okay. Any questions about that?
I might have missed this earlier, but what do we do with the chunk labels? Do we refer back to them later, or why do we put those in there?
Sure. So one of the things that it's useful for is when it's processing, it labels the output. And so you'll know, like, if there's an error, let's say there was an error here. Let me just put an error. Oh, so if you look at the actual output, you'll see that it got to my data and then it errored. So then you'll know, oh, it's somewhere in here that I need to look. Another thing that it's useful for is that if you make images, if you don't specify a specific name for the image to save, it'll save it using the chunk option name. So if I made an image in here, like with ggplot, the name of the image would then be saved as mydata.png, for instance. I don't know exactly what format it saves in, but it's just an automatic way of naming an image. But those are two of the things I can think of that are useful for the chunk option. But it is actually optional. So you don't have to put a chunk up. Oh, sorry. You don't have to put a chunk option. I'm sorry, you don't have to put a chunk label in there if you don't want to. But I tend to, because it is helpful to identify where problems are when you actually knit it. Okay. Oh, here is that warning message I was telling you about. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Any other questions about these chunk options we've gone over so far? Great. I do want to mention a special function that's called cable. It creates the cable function with a K is installed with the knitter package, and it creates very nice looking tables in the output. So usually the table input is some kind of data frame or matrix or an actual R table, and it's the first argument to cable. Inside of Cable, you can also specify arguments that control the number of digits printed, the column names, the column alignment, table captions, and other formatting options. I'm not going to go over any of those options today. If you want to have real fine control over the tables, you should look at this other package that's called Cable Extra. I give you a link to it here, and you can see. So this is how the table will come out if you use Cable. For instance, it'll look nice and formatted like this. But for instance, if you want to have more control over its appearance, like let's say you want every other line to be have a different background color, or have more control over the table's appearance, you'll need extra packages to do that. But just to give you an idea, I want you to take the first line where we have just sleep and replace it with this code right here. And I'll explain what that code says in just a second. So go into here, around line 28 on mine, I have the code sleep, which would just print the data set. We're actually just going to print the data set again, but we're going to make it look a little prettier. All right. So the function again is table, which is located inside the knitter package. For those of you that don't know R coding, this is how you say this function in this package. The two colons mean first the package and then the function. And then the first argument is the table that you want to output. And in this case, it's the data set itself called sleep. And I'm going to say, please center the columns. All right. And when we look at the output, you'll see that you get this nicer looking table here, which has centered columns. Right. So this is the sleep data set, but printed in a nicer way. All right. Table especially looks good for LaTeX files, I have to say. So here, this is what Cable looks like in a LaTeX file, these two middle tables right here. So really useful for that. Okay. Inline R code. So we've been talking about code chunks, but you can also actually process R code directly in the text too. All right, not in like a whole separate chunk. So if you want to put some R code directly in text, you enclose it with these tags, a single backtick in R, and then another backtick. So in this case, the inline R code is not printed to the document. Only the result of the code inside will be printed. Okay, and you can use Markdown tags to then format that output too. Oops, sorry, I'm spelling it. Format that output. Okay, so what I want you to do is in the R Markdown file, I put this little XXX at the very end of the Markdown file. And I want you to replace that XXX with this code right here. So grab everything from the first tick to the last tick. Okay. And then go into your R Markdown file. And at the very end, I put this XXX, and I just want you to replace over that. Okay. Now, let's see what happens. So basically, this code, sorry, is asking for the mean of this variable called extra. And now it actually will directly print the mean of that variable into the text. All right. So, but as you can see, the R code is not printed to the text. And as I mentioned before, you can use Markdown tags to format this inline R code output. All right, so we can add these two stars, which are bold tags, to bold this R code output. And so when I knit that, now this 1.54 is bolded. Okay, so if you want to, put in some statistic into your text directly, you can just write the code for it. And then if that statistic changes, because let's say your data set changes, you don't have to recode or anything. You just put in the new data set, and now that mean will change, right? So you don't have to like go in and manually change the mean yourself. It will automatically change when you change the data set. So that's what we mean when we say that it's a dynamic document. That when you change the data, for instance, the entire document will change. Right? All of the graphs, all of the statistics will all be different, but you can leave the R Markdown as is because it will work with whatever data set you put in. Okay. Okay. Any questions on what we've gone over so far in this R code chunk section? Okay, then I think it's a good time for a break. We still have more to cover with our code chunks, and then we're going to talk a little bit about our notebooks. We're going to end with a YAML header. But let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 2:30, and then we'll finish the rest of the seminar. And I'm going to go break really quickly, but I'll be back for anybody that has questions, and I'll be here again until 2:30 when we start over again. Okay, so let's take a break. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and restart. Thank you all for coming back. We are on, sorry, let me close some things. Let me reshare too. Oh. Okay, here we go. So we had just gone over a bunch of chunk options to format the code. Now we're going, and the code output, now we're going to look at chunk options for figures, because a lot of the time you're going to have figures made from either the R-based functions like plots or bar plot, or you might have figures created by ggplot, for instance, and you might want to know how you can format those in your document too. For this part of the seminar, we're going to be using the package Tidyverse, which is a diverse collection of packages for data analysis. We're going to be using a specific subset of them, ggplot, dplyr, and broom. Please, I ask you to have these installed beforehand. You can try installing it now. Tidyverse does take a few minutes though, so if you're going to install it now, you're going to have to do it quick. For everybody though, let's go ahead and start on a new R Markdown file. So open the mileage R Markdown file, please. So you can close the sleep study, and let's start on a new one that's called mileage. Okay, and just so you know, I did not write all of these codes. I've adapted some of these codes from other people's R Markdown files. So I don't know exactly what all these files are doing. Well, I do know what they're doing, but I don't know like necessarily the purpose of writing these files. Okay. Knitr and R Markdown make including and formatting graphics really easy in our documents. So the graphics that are produced by the R code are placed immediately after the code chunk that generates that graphic, just like the output of any R code. Right? So the mileage file already has a bunch of code to create images in there. So I want you to go ahead and just knit that. And let's observe what I'm talking about. It will take a little bit longer to knit than the sleep study because it has a little bit more content. But you'll see, for instance, here is a ggplot call, which is the plotting function, a very popular plotting package called ggplot2. And it produces really nice looking graphics like this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that just like any output, Knitr will place the output of the R code chunk right afterwards. And in this case, it's a graphic. Okay. And we can see there are several graphics in here. And this code chunk, sorry, it's this one right here. You see there's 3 ggplots right here. And just like before, by default, it will do one piece of coding, then its output, then the next piece of coding, and then its output, and so on. So each piece of code that produces output has its output right underneath. Okay. So first, let's talk about how we can arrange multiple figures produced by the same code chunk. All right, so as we discussed, there's that one code chunk that has 3 graphs produced by it. And maybe we don't like how it's looking right now. The chunk option we're going to talk about is fig.show first. And it determines how to place multiple plots. It's kind of similar to the results option that we looked at earlier. So as is what it's set to by default. Again, if I put an option in parentheses here, that means what's default. And as is just says put each plot immediately after the code chunk, immediately after the piece of code that produced it. All right. Then we have another option that we've seen before, which is hold. And that means put all the code together and put all the graphics together at the end. And then if you don't want to show the graphics, you put hide. All right. So what I want you to do is the fourth chunk is called mileage graph. I want you to add this chunk option fig.show equals hold, okay, and put it into that chunk header mileage graph. So on mine, it's line 57, okay. Remember the comma, and then just copy and paste, or you can write out fig.show equals hold in single quotes, okay. Once you've done that, go ahead and knit, and you'll see what happens. You should know what's going to happen, though, is that it's going to put all of the code together here, and then all of the graphs together afterwards. Okay, so that's what hold does. I want you to leave this fig.show equals hold here for the rest of the seminar. All right, we're going to just leave it there because the rest of the options are going to build on this option. Okay, so one of the main things we often have to do with figures is size them. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that sizing is an easy thing to do. It doesn't always work the way you want it to work. There are a lot of different things under the hood that control sizing, and you're going to have to play around with this quite a bit. So just a warning. But just to give you an idea of what the things you can do, you can, for instance, set the width and the height of the figure, and by default, it'll be measuring in inches. So the default figure size is 7 inches wide and 5 inches tall. And then you can also set the aspect ratio of the plot, which is basically the width divided by the height divided by the width. So if only one of the two, fig.width or fig.height, is specified, it does not adjust the other one, unless you also specify fig.ask, okay? So if you just specify fig.width, it'll change the width of the figure, but it won't change the height, okay? But if you also specify fig.ask, then it will change the height so that the aspect ratio is what you want. Okay, so let's try this. But we're gonna change the width of our graphs in this mileage graphs chunk to just 3 inches. So add the option fig.width equals 3 to the code chunk mileage graphs, and let's see what happens to the size of these graphs. So remember to separate your options with commas, right? And then you're going to just type or copy and paste fig.width equals 3. And then when you've done that, hit knit. And you can see, for me, it's made them quite narrow, right? But it has not adjusted the height, right? As you can see, they're still 5 inches tall, but they're 3 inches wide. And in addition, it's actually put 2 of them on the same row. And if I look, I think at the final, the actual file itself, which is full screen, they're all in one row here, all right? So it will try to place things for you in a way that fits. It will try to make guesses. These may or may not be what you want. So this is what I mean when I say you're gonna have to play around with some image options to get everything exactly like you want, all right? Because it might do things unexpectedly like this, okay? But all of this can be adjusted. Okay, now let's add the option fig.ask to the same, fig.ask equals 1, sorry, to the same chunk, all right? So we're gonna restore the aspect ratio to what it originally was, all right? So now the height will be scaled accordingly, all right? So just comma, and then fig.ask equals 1, all right? And this will set the aspect ratio back down to 1. Okay, so now the height is again more relative to the width, was the same relative height that we had before relative to its width. Okay. Okay. Now, if let's say you wanted to change all of the figures in the document. So you notice I changed these figures, but this figure is still its original size. How would I change the size of all the figures in the document? Well, you remember at the top, we often have these global options specified here. So for instance, if I put, sorry for scrolling so much, if I put fig.width equals 3 and fig.asp equals 1 in the global options here, and you can do this, you don't have to do this if you don't want. You could just, for instance, type out anything you want. It will create the first bar graph, excuse me, that first bar graph will now also be this size. So you can see it's been resized as well. Now, one thing you might be wondering is if I specify this global option and then I specify a local option here, let's say I specify a 5 here, what will these be? It will take, these local options take precedence. So even though I specified in the global option that all figures be 3 inches wide, because I specified 5 in this single chunk, the images in this chunk will be 5 inches wide. Okay, so you can specify a global option, but then change it for a specific chunk in a single chunk. Okay. Okay. We also have an option to adjust the alignment of the figures in the document. Okay. So for instance, if we want them all on the left, all on the center, or all on the right, let's put them all in the center. So let's say we want all of our figures centered. We're going to put that in the global chunks option at the very top. So global chunk options go inside this knitr ops chunk set, also separated by commas. So I'm adding fig.align equals center into the global options, and that will control every figure afterwards. So now I'm knitting it. And you can see now that all of our figures have been centered. And so because they're all centered, it cannot put them all into one row anymore, right? So it will now just put one per row. So these, you have to experiment with all of these figure options to understand the output that comes out of it, right? Take some time to learn. Okay, any questions on these two slides about figure sizing? No? Okay, let's talk about captions then. So you'll notice by default, there are no captions here. This is just the name of the x-axis. No captions. You can easily add a caption with the fig.cap knitr option. Okay, so by default, it's set to null, meaning no figure caption, but you just put in single quotes. I think you'd also use double quotes. A lot of places in R Markdown where you have a single quote, a double quote will work just as well. So for instance, we can add fig.cap equals fig1 to the first chunk that's called, the chunk that's called sample. Okay, so let's add that to the chunk that's called sample, which is on around line 45. Okay, so remember comma, fig.cap equals fig1 in quotes. Okay, that goes for sample. And then I want to add another one for this one, mileage graphs. Here we're just going to change it to fig2, but something interesting happens here. Okay, so let's go ahead and knit that. So what it does, interestingly enough, it puts fig1 as expected underneath of the first figure, but it considers all 3 of these figure. I'm sorry, that should have been figure 2. Sorry about that. It puts all 3 of them together. It groups them all as one figure 2, and you'll see that as soon as it comes up. Yeah. So now, previously these were all centered individually, but then when I added the figure caption, it grouped two of them together into one line again. And this is what I mean that you're just going to have to kind of learn these rules and experiment to get exactly what you want. Okay, because unexpected things kind of happen when you play with these options. They all make sense when you think about it, but you may not be able to anticipate what's going to happen if you haven't done it. I'm not going to go over saving them, but if you can save the figures as separate files, if you need to do that, you can look at this slide. Okay. Any questions about what we've done with figures in the R code chunks? Any questions at all? Because we're going to be leaving code chunks after this.
If you wanted captions for each of those 3 individual plots, would you do something like fig.cap equals C and then have each caption separated by commas?
Honestly, I don't know if that works. Let me try it really fast. The other option I would say is you'd have to do 3 separate code chunks. Today. Let's see. No, it seemed that I don't know what happened there. I feel like you'd have to, it's interesting because it didn't error, but I think the best way would to do 3 separate chunks. Yeah. Other questions?
Andy, there is a question asking why does the green run chunk arrow is in the upper right corner of R chunk sometimes not show? I'm
Why
not
does
sure.
this green arrow sometimes not show? Usually it should show. It sometimes doesn't show if it's the R code chunk is not properly delineated.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like if you didn't close it correctly or you didn't open and close it correctly, you may not see these symbols. And we're going to discuss what these symbols are in just 1 minute. It's literally the next section. So I will go over what those little guys mean in just a second. Okay. All right. So I assume there's no more questions. Then let's move on. Okay. R notebooks. Okay. So where are my R objects? We've run all this code. And for those of you that are experienced with RStudio, usually all these objects like this and this would appear in this environment. So where are they? None of them are here. Well, something special goes on when you knit, and that's what I'm going to go over next. So every time we render our document with the knit button, none of the R objects appear in the current R session. And the reason why this is because when you click that knit button, what R Markdown does is it actually starts a new R session in the background, okay? And it uses this new R session to execute all the R code. And then after the R Markdown file is done, it closes this background R session completely, okay? So some things to know is that the working directory of the new session is automatically set to the same directory as the location of the RMD file, not necessarily where the working directory is in the current R session in RStudio that you're working with. The working directory of that background R session where this code is being run is the directory where that RMD file is located. Now you can change that working directory inside of a code chunk, but this will only change the directory in the background R session, not in the current R session, okay? So any R packages that are necessary to run the R code must be loaded in the RMD document. So for instance, this code depends on this package ggplot2. Again, when I run this, by clicking the knit button, it opens up a new R session in the background and it runs all this code, including this library function, which loads the ggplot function, which loads the ggplot2 package into that background R session. But what won't happen is it won't load it into this current R session. So I can't use ggplot2 functions right away. I have to load it independently into this current R session. All right. Okay, so why do they do this? Well, rendering a new session ensures that the document is totally reproducible because it prevents any dependencies on objects in the current R session, right? So, you might have code in here that says X equals Y times 2. If Y is defined in the current R session, but not in this code, it might work here, but it might not work if you put it on somebody else's computer. And so forcing it to run in a completely new R session ensures that it will work on anybody's computer, no matter what the current R session has in it. And so that's the reason why they do it. Okay, so you might say, well, that seems a little inconvenient. What if I want to look at some of these intermediate results? And in fact, somebody in chat, it's a very good question. And the answer is, well, the RStudio people thought of that and they created these R notebooks. Okay, so when you're editing an R Markdown document with RStudio, it actually is edited as an R notebook. And R notebooks allow the user to execute each R code chunk interactively. And it'll place the output immediately below the code chunk itself in the R Markdown document. And so these R notebooks are R Markdown files in every sense. It's just an interactive mode for creating an R Markdown document. Okay. You'll know that RStudio is treating your RMD file as an R notebook if you see these buttons at the top right of each R code block. All right, and those buttons are this little cogwheel, here, and then this kind of gray triangle on top of a green bar, and then this little green play button. Okay, those are the signifiers that you can use this as an R notebook. Okay, so everybody check to make sure that, and you should have these, most of you should have these, as long as you didn't change these chunks, they should be all here. So what do these buttons do? The green button on the right will run the R code in the current chunk and place the output beneath the chunk. The gray triangle and the green bar button in the middle, so the middle button will run all the R code chunks before the current chunk, and it'll place those outputs also in the R notebook. And then finally, the cogwheel on the left is used to set up chunk options for the current R code chunk. Okay, so I want you to try using this. So locate the code chunk that's called mileage graphs, and I want you to first click the middle button. The mileage graphs on mine is around line 57. Okay, the middle button again is the one with the gray triangle on top of the green bar. Click that, and what that will do is it'll run all the code chunks on top of this chunk first. And then what you'll notice is it places the output directly into this R Markdown editing space, right? So here's the graph produced by this code chunk, all right? So the middle button says, run all the code chunks on top of this one. And then this green button on the right is run this current chunk. So usually when you do this, you do want to make sure you've run all the other code chunks first, because you might be using code that's dependent on previous code chunks. So first run the middle one, then run on the right. Okay. And if the code chunk produces multiple pieces of outputs, then you might see these little boxes that separate the individual pieces of output. Now, some of you might have a warning. I sent newly revised files this morning to everybody. If you're not using the newly revised one, you'll see a little warning. So you might actually have 4 boxes here. The change I made, this used to be fun.y, now it's called fun. Again, other R package, so the ggplot package changed its coding in between. So fortunately that it doesn't really affect anything, but you might see another box here if you're running an old version of this file. But the point I'm trying to make though is that now you don't have to knit every time. You can just run, if you want to alter the code in here and see the results, you can just hit this button, and then say, oh, okay. Let's say you want to change the color in here. you can respecify and then just rerun this code rather than having to knit the whole document. Because if your document's really big, or let's say your data set's really big, it could take a lot of time to run the entire file again. So it makes it very, very convenient. And you can close these outputs, with these little X buttons. You can also go to edit, and then you can do clear all outputs, and it will just close them all for you, for instance. All right, so let's edit, clear all output here. Okay, but that basically lets you edit these R Markdown documents in a really dynamic way, so you can see the output right underneath where you're writing it. It's really, really useful. And so most people who write R Markdown documents will, check if that code chunk runs by using these buttons. Okay. Any questions about our notebooks? And again, an R notebook is really just the interactive version of the R Markdown file. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So hopefully this is a good time to ask this, but if I'm not seeing the notebook controls, the green arrow, for example, in the R chunk, it's in one of the RMDs and not the one that I'm using right now, not the sleep or whichever one.
So this one is called mileage. Is it also, is it .rmd?
Yeah, .rmd.
Okay, and none of them have it?
None of them have it, yeah.
When you knit it though, the whole thing works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I knit it, it's fine.
The other file did have it though?
Sleep did have it, yeah, does have it.
I honestly don't know then. I'd have to look specifically, but I'm
It's okay,
sorry.
no worries.
That's a very weird error. Yeah, a lot of times, I think we were talking about earlier is, if you don't properly close this for some reason, then sometimes these code chunks fail. But yeah, if it knits correctly, they should appear there. I'm trying to think why they wouldn't, and I don't know why. I'm sorry. We'd have to look more closely at your RStudio to figure that out. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so we're going to move on then to the last portion, which discusses the Yaml header. And this is kind of the fun portion because you get to see all the different output formats. So the purpose of the Yaml header, as we discussed before, is we communicate with Pandoc. And again, remember, Pandoc is the program that's loaded with R Markdown that converts one output format to a different one. Like for instance, Markdown to HTML, or Markdown to LaTeX, or Markdown to Word, okay? Which options are available to use depend on which output format you plan to use. So for instance, the options for HTML are different from the options for a LaTeX document, all right? And which are different from the options for a Word document. There are cheat sheets that you can look at to see tables of options. So let me show you those cheat sheets first. So if you go into RStudio and you go to Help, and then you go down to Cheat Sheets, we're looking for the R Markdown cheat sheet right here, okay? That will open up a web page, sorry, a PDF. It'll download a PDF for you. And then here, a little small, sorry. This table shows you the output formats, HTML, LaTeX PDF, Word document, for example, and then shows you which options are actually available for this particular output format. So for instance, citation package is available for LaTeX PDF, but not for an HTML. You'll notice in general, the most flexible is HTML, which Slidey is also an HTML format too. So anything that's kind of HTML related will have a lot of options. LaTeX has some, Word has a few, for instance. They were planning on doing PowerPoint. I don't know how well PowerPoint is going yet, but I know PowerPoint was planned to be one of the output formats. Last year when I looked at it, it was sort of in still the kind of early stages, but PowerPoint apparently, I don't know how far they've gotten with it yet, but it is one of the goals, I thought. Okay, so that is just to show you that the different options depend on which output format you plan to use. So to specify the YAML header, remember that it's delineated by those 3 dashes at the top and then the 3 dashes at the bottom. If you open a new R Markdown file template in R Studio, just like we did at the beginning of the seminar when we opened the very first one ourselves through the file menu, you'll see the options title and output. Okay, and you'll notice that the output is set to HTML by default. It actually turns out that the YAML header is optional, and if you omit it completely, it'll just produce an HTML document. All right, so you don't actually have to even put the YAML header in if you don't want, but then you won't have any control over its overall output. Okay, so we're going to cover some of these output options now. Now, it turns out though that the YAML header is one of the trickier things to specify because it's really picky about its coding and its indentation specifically. And it seems a little arbitrary if you're not a coder or a YAML coder specifically, how to indent. I'm sure there's a reason for it, but if you're not really familiar like I was, it will seem a little mysterious. So you're just going to have to learn it, and it will take some getting used to again. All right, so again, indentation is important when specifying sub-options, which are options for options in the YAML header. Okay, so the option name should not be indented. So for instance, here, output is the first option, or title is the first option. If no sub-option is specified, then the option value should be specified on the same line as the name. So if I didn't have any sub-options, which are these TOC and TOC float, I would actually put HTML document on the same line as output, okay? If you look at the file that we've just been using, it's specified like that here. So since I have no additional options for HTML documents, HTML document goes on the same line. But if I want to specify more options for HTML documents, I would actually indent HTML document twice, put a colon, and then start the options down there, right? But since that's not the case for this file, I put it on the same line. Okay, I know this is a little tricky. All right, if you do want to specify sub-options, the option value should be on the next line indented 2 spaces, okay? So here, I put HTML document indented 2 spaces, and then underneath these, this is actually the HTML document is the value of output. I put another colon after that to specify the sub-options. And this is asking for a table of contents, and this is asking for a floating table of contents specifically. But this is indented 2 spaces, these are indented 4 spaces. And RStudio tries to help you, actually. So as you could see, like when I typed HTML document, if I then indented it 2 and then hit a colon, it'll automatically indent 4 spaces for you. And so here, for instance, I could type TOC, true, and then TOC float, also. So it's trying to help you as best as it can. But, you know, it only knows so much, so it may not get it perfect. So it's best that you learn this coding yourself. So what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and replace the current YAML header with this one right here. And you can type it if you like, but it's probably easier just to copy the whole thing and replace the whole YAML header like that. Okay. Now you have to copy all the spacing faithfully or it won't work. All right. If you knit and you get no options, you've done it right. But if you knit and you get no errors, you've done it right. And so again, just copy and paste the whole thing and then knit. And then what you'll see in the HTML document is, oh, we have this table of contents now, right? How nice. And it's floating on the left, actually. That's the float means that it's kind of on the left by itself, and you can click on the different headings, it'll advance you to that section of the document. So a nice thing to put if you have a long document, a table of contents. Okay. Parameters. All right, so parameters are one of the great things about YAML headers. What it allows you to do is that you can specify a specific parameter in your YAML heading, which you then pass down to the R code somewhere else in the document. Okay, so what this allows you to do is it gives you a really easy way to generate different reports depending on the input. So for instance, let's say you had 3 age groups. You had the young people, the middle people, and the older people. And you wanted to do one report for the young people, one report for the middle people, and one report for the older people. Well, instead of writing code for all 3 people, you can just have a parameter that says subset the data to just these people, and then run the rest of the code on that subsetted data set, for instance, right? So subset it just to the young people, and then run the rest of the code. And you can put that parameter in the YAML heading at the very, very top, so that you don't have to go finding that little piece of code where you specify that group somewhere deep inside some R code chunk somewhere else. So it makes it really easy for you to vary the inputs or vary the grouping of the data analysis that happens inside of these R code chunks. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to do one of these. It first starts with the params option. Now again, since params is the option itself, the word params and the colon is not going to be indented. So put it all the way on the left. Then underneath that, you're going to put the name of the parameter and then colon its value. But you need to indent the name of the parameter by 2 spaces. Okay, so I give you an example here. Params is not indented, it's all the way on the left. Then I give the parameter a name. So here I'm going to give it the parameter name manufacturer, colon, its value. So that is indented 2 spaces. Then in the R code, I can do params, $ param name, and that will take on this value Dodge, for instance. So I somewhere in the code, I would have params, $ manufacturer, and then whatever value I specify here will be the value taken on by this variable. All right, so we can see this in action. What I want you to do first is go into this R Markdown file we've been using, the mileage one, and at the very bottom, the very last code chunk, on mine it's around line 79, I want you to change eval equals false to eval equals true. Okay, so the name of the code chunk is subgroup plot. I'm going to now change it to eval equals true. Okay, now what you'll notice here is that there is this params $ manufacturer. So this is what will take on this Dodge value or whatever value I specify here. Okay, and then this code chunk basically creates a graph, excuse me, like a kind of a best fit line graph only for cars made by this manufacturer. Okay, so let's try this. I want you to go to the top of this document inside the YAML header, and then let's specify this new param. All right, so the option is params, no indentation, colon. Okay, P-R-A-M-S, colon. Next line, notice that RStudio is trying to be helpful. It'll indent it for you by 2 spaces. You can type out manufacturer and then colon, oops, make sure you spell it right, manufacturer, colon, and then you can start with Dodge. If you prefer, you can just copy and paste this directly into here also. Okay, it look just like this. Remember, the indentation is critical. Okay, so now when I run this code, that final code chunk is now active because we turned eval to true. Remember, when eval was false, it would just skip it. Now it's also in the table of contents. Okay, and so that params is used in this title right here, manufacturer Dodge. This is params $ manufacturer. And this data set is only the Dodge cars right here. Okay. So now I can change this Dodge right here to one of these other values. And I invite you to do this right now. Just change it to either Chevrolet, Ford, Jeep, Lincoln, Mercury, or Pontiac, any one of these, and then re-render the document. Okay. So for instance, just go in here. I'm going to change this to Ford. Okay. And now you'll see wherever params $ manufacturer is, it'll now be Ford instead of Dodge. And so that title, I did a little trick here. this title is actually created in the R code chunk. And this word right here is based on params $manufacturer. All right, so this word right here gets changed, but then this graph is based on subgroup, and this subgroup is a subset of the data set where this manufacturer is equal to this value Ford right here. Okay, and so this is what one of the great things about R Markdown is that you can easily have customized reports for different groups just by changing that one parameter param, right? And now it says Ford here, and now these all data points all belong to Ford cars. Okay, so hopefully you can see how useful this would be in your own data analysis if you, let's say you're doing stratified analyses across different groups. It's super useful. Any questions on parameters? No? Okay. Let's move on. All right, so we have kind of gone over what I want to go over in terms of the YAML header options. Well, that's not true. I'm going to mention more options, but the options I'm going to talk about now are specific to a particular output format. And so we're going to look at a few different output formats. As you know, as I've said many times, the same RMD file can produce an HTML document, a LaTeX PDF document, a Word document, or a slideshow, for instance. I've given you a link for a full list of the available output formats. Let's just take a quick look at that to see if anything's changed. Beamer is a LaTeX style slideshow. Yeah, see, PowerPoint is still here. So they do plan on, I guess, making PowerPoint presentations. I'm not sure how well it works yet, to be honest, but it's, like I said, it's definitely one of the options. Okay, for each output format, as we saw, it has its own set of options to control its appearance. And to do this, we're going to now use the third file, which is Texas Housing Sales. Now, you have to use the version I sent to you today, or if you don't have that handy, you can use the one that's on the seminar webpage. This one is also the most current one. But for those of you who I emailed on Friday, don't use the version I sent you on Friday. It will error. All right, and I'm very sorry about that I didn't catch that earlier, but please do use the one from today. Okay, so let me go ahead and open that file myself. Here. Okay, now I also warn you this file is quite a bit bigger. So it will take like 30 seconds maybe to render each time. So just be patient. Each time it'll take a little bit of time for you to see the preview. But I want it to be nice and long so you could see a lot of cool things. All right. As I said, Markdown's original purpose was to simplify HTML coding. So HTML documents will have the most options available in R Markdown. We've already seen adding a table of contents using TOC true, but I'm going to mention a few more useful sub-options for HTML documents. Okay, one of them is theme. Okay, so theme changes the overall look of the entire document. All right, it adjusts the font family, the font colors, and sometimes the background colors too. Okay, so it can make a really big change of the whole look just by one little option. Highlight specifically alters the appearance of the code. So if you want, you know, the way it colors different things in code, like function names may be colored one way, variable names may be colored a different way. The way those things are colored are determined by highlight, the highlight option. And then code folding allows you to insert buttons that will hide the code or show the code. All right. And we're gonna experiment with each one of these three right now. So look at your RMD file, this Texas Housing Sales file, and you'll see that it's already set to be an HTML document. Underneath this, we're going to add the options. Okay, and so hopefully our Markdown will automatically indent you 4 spaces. If it doesn't, if it puts you all the way back at the left, hit space 4 times. Okay. And then we're going to start by adding the theme option. Okay, so I want you to type out theme, colon, And then you can put any one of these right here, cerulean, journal, flatly, darkly, any one of these you want, put in there. Darkly will really change the look, so I'm going to use darkly just because it's really dramatic. All right, and then after that's done, just hit knit. Again, it'll take a little bit longer to render. So give it a little bit more time. But the graphics are really nice looking in this. So I just wanted you to see what a nice looking document you can make out of R Markdown. So you can see now it has a it has a black background and the text is white, right? And I think the font also changed. So the font face also might have changed as well. But all of this is controlled by that single option theme. You know, I could change it to something else. I think Cosmo was one. Let's just look at one more. And you'll have to experiment to see which one you end up liking the most. But there are a lot of options to altering the appearance. Now, if you want to alter, you know, just one aspect of the appearance, and I'll go over this a little more, you're going to have to use probably actual HTML or CSS. So yeah, here's a second new look. And again, the fonts have changed, the background has changed color, and so on. So theme changes the overall look of the entire document. Highlight changes just the look of the coding, the R coding. So let's add that option just for fun. So underneath theme, we can add a second option. Let's say highlight. Okay, highlight. And then add one of these highlight options. So Tango, Pigments, Cape, Monochrome, Espresso, and so on. I'm just going to pick one. I'll try Espresso. Espresso. Okay. Once you've added one of those, you can do whatever you like. Hit knit, and let's see if the code looks different now. And again, it's going to take a little while to run. We'll give it a little time. Okay. Yes, now you can see that my coding looks really different. Now it has a black background and has like orange and green highlighting. And this was espresso, all right? And again, there are many options for code highlighting. Finally, I'm going to add the option code folding hide, all right? And what this will do is it'll add these buttons that will allow you to hide or show the code in the document itself. Okay, so I'm just copying and pasting this in. You can type it if you want. It's code underscore folding and then hide. Okay, and when you knit that, you'll see these cool new buttons that say code on them. And let's see what happens when we click on them. Almost there. Code folding adds a little bit more to the output. Okay, so for each bit of code, there is a button here that you can click that will either show or hide it. And there's in fact an overall global button at the top that says show all code or hide all code. Right? So now it really is a dynamic document in the sense that you can interact with it yourself. And again, this was the preview, but if you look at the actual HTML file that's produced, it also has the code button on them too, right? So it's really nice looking output file, and maybe your PI doesn't want to see it, or maybe your colleague doesn't want to see it, or maybe they do, and then they can control that easily. Okay, so that is styling and hiding code on an HTML document. The R Markdown Definitive Guide is an online web book. And so if you really want to dive into R Markdown really deeply, I recommend that you go to this web book and just read it, which is basically what I did to create this presentation. And inside the documents, so output formats is one of the sections. And then inside each of the document sections, you'll find all the options you can use to change their format. So like, for instance, there's a HTML, there's a PDF, Word, and so on and so on. All right, I'm only going to mention this. I'm not going to go over this today. But if you want to have a lot of fine control over the appearance of your HTML document, you know, let's say you want to just change the background color and leave other things as they are. Well, you can't really do that with theme, right? Theme will change everything for you at once. It doesn't say just change this part of it, not the other parts. So if you want to change specific things, you really are going to have to learn HTML itself or CSS or both, okay? The nice thing about these R Markdown files is that you can add HTML directly into the file itself, okay? So for instance, I can add this code tag, red. And I'm just going to do, you don't have to do this. Just can add this somewhere. Let's add this to this word this, okay? And so I'm putting the HTML directly into the text. And then when I render the file, it will actually use that HTML to format the text around it. And you won't see the HTML tags at all in the text. You'll just see the properly formatted output. And so the word this should appear as red in the output. And it does, all right? So you can do, if you are familiar with HTML, you can use it directly into the document itself. And for instance, a lot of this document, this slideshow that I created for this presentation does use actually quite a bit of raw HTML. You can also use CSS, which allows you to globally style your document. For instance, here I provide some coding to change the background color and change the font family. And you can literally put this also in the document. And I'm just going to do this, and I don't expect you to, but you can, for instance, put it here. I'm not going to really explain the coding, but this is what's called CSS, cascading style sheets. It's another way for you to style HTML documents. And again, it's usually used for more of a global control of the appearance of the document. But the point is that you can have very fine control over the appearance of these things, but you do need to know some additional coding. So here I made the background blue, I changed the font to Garamond, and I changed the font size to 20. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to do this yourself. I just want to mention it. Okay. So we've gone over HTML. I want to show you the slideshow formats. All right, I'm going to delete this style section. If you did try the style section, go ahead and delete it when you're done. So there are at least 3 different slideshow presentations. I should have had PowerPoint too here actually, but at the time it wasn't fully working. I'm going to go over IO slides and Slidey. I'm not going to go over Beamer today though. All right, we're going to see examples of IO slides and Slidey. HTML slideshows are opened and viewed in a web browser like Chrome, just like any other HTML file. All right, so the output file is going to be an HTML, which you'll open in your web browser. So some of you may use Safari, for instance, Chrome, whatever you use. Okay. HTML slideshows can also be styled with HTML and CSS, while Beamer slideshows can be styled with LaTeX. Okay. Now, in older versions of R Markdown, sometimes the preview of the slideshow looks kind of bad, but the actual slideshow may look good. But they might have improved that over time. So we'll see. Okay. So slideshows will use the section headers as indicators of a new slide. Okay. And then the header becomes the header of the slide. So for instance, if you see hashtag purpose, that will start a new slide and the title of that slide will be purpose. A level 1 header where you have a single hashtag is treated as a title slide. So there's no text that goes underneath this title slide. It's basically, you know, if you had a PowerPoint slide presentation, if you wanted the word header to appear nice and big all by itself, that's the title slide. So don't put any text on a slideshow slide that has a single level header or a level 1 header, because if you put text on that slide, it kind of mangles everything else in the rest of the slideshow. So make sure you don't do that. Then you have a header with 2 hashtags, a level 2 header. That will initiate a new slide, but those slides are the ones that you can have additional content underneath. All right, so those will be your content slides, right? So a level 1 header is the title slide, a level 2 header is a content slide. Now, if you want a slide that does not have a header on it, you can also start a new slide with dash, dash, dash. All right, so whenever you have dash, 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 Markdown will translate that to say, oh, here we're going to start a new slide, but I don't want to put any header on it. Okay. Another nice thing you can do with slides is when you remember we learned how to do bulleted lists a long time ago with the star symbol and then pluses and minuses. If you want to have a bulleted list that appears item by item as you click, you can use this less than minus code instead of a star. And in PowerPoint, you can make bulleted lists that each item appears one at a time as you click through it. You can do the same thing in R Markdown. So you actually have quite a bit of control with these slideshows. Okay, let's start by looking at an aisle slides presentation. They look really great. They have this nice background, and the knitted tables really look nice on aisle slides. So let's just see what one looks like. I want you just actually to copy and paste this entire YAML header. So just copy the whole thing, okay? Copy it and replace the YAML header and the Texas mileage document with this new header. And so what you'll see is now output is aisle slides presentation, and I've added these 2 options for aisle slides, which are smaller and widescreen, and I'll tell you what those are in just a second. So go ahead and knit that. And now you'll see the output looks completely different from what we were looking at before. And all we did was change the header, right? We didn't change any of the code or any of the text underneath. We just changed the header, and you'll see how different this looks. All right, so we literally get a slideshow. If you really want to, you might need to make it full screen to see everything. But it is indeed this really nice looking slideshow. And you can kind of see this is the top of a, I'm trying to find an actual, oh yeah. So here is what a cable table looks like. It's really nice looking in these IO slides. But you'll notice the problem that I have with IO slides is that they are of a fixed size, especially a fixed vertical size. So it'll just cut off the bottom of a slide. So you really can't put a lot of content on an aisle slide. I wouldn't, do a lot of code and code chunks and output on a aisle slides presentation because it just gets too crowded. If you have mostly just text, it works well. But if you have a lot of graphs and figures and code and output, it probably won't work as well. So keep that in mind. Close this. Now I added 2 options just to tell you what they are. The smaller option uses smaller fonts. So actually these fonts in the preview, these are actually the smaller fonts. And if you had even bigger fonts, then there's even less that you can fit onto one slide. And then the widescreen also makes the slide wider. So these are both to help you fit even more content onto one slide so that less gets cut off. But even with these 2 options, I still get cut off on most of these slides. And so for my presentations, I can't often use IO slides because it's just too small. Oh yes, and I was just gonna say, there's a few places at the end where we don't even get to see a bunch of plots. So this section at the end, diagnostic plots, there's actually a whole bunch of plots, but since they all get cut off, you can't see them. So for instance, if I go and enter here, dash, 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 so 3 hashtags does not initiate a new slide at all. You have to have either 2 or 1 to start a new slide. So instead, I can do dash, dash, dash here, and for instance, dash, dash, dash here. And then now you'll notice right now there's only 12 slides in the presentation. If I rerun or reknit this with those dash, 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 now these 2 will be new slides, and we should have at least 14 slides now. Hopefully. Give it a second. Yes, now we have 14 slides, and these 2 slides at the end are now, you can now see them. So use the hashtag headers to initiate slides, and also use dash, dash, dash to initiate a new slide without a header. Okay. Any questions about this first slideshow presentation? Okay.
I had a question. Is there a way to change the aspect ratio of the plots? Or is that pretty much like,
yeah,
there's the default and that's it?
You can use that that option in the knitter options, this one, fig.asp right here. And then it's defined as height over width. So I think it has, this is the natural aspect ratio, 5/7. And so you can change, I think you then, you know, put a number in here that's some multiple, and then it'll multiply 5/7 by that number to give you your new aspect ratio. But yeah, if you want to control that, use fig.asp in the chunk header section. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Let's try a different slideshow presentation. Let's try slidey presentations. So slidey is actually the format I use for this presentation that you're looking at right now. And one of the main advantages of these slidey presentations is that the vertical size of a slide is unlimited. So you can actually scroll down on a lot of these slides, and it prevents material from getting cut off. All right. So now I want you to replace the YAML header with this. So just copy and paste the entire YAML header over the old one. Okay. So what I want you to notice now, instead of slides presentations, we've changed to slidey presentation, and we've added these 2 options. One of them makes the font smaller. So font adjustment -1 makes the font smaller. And then footer adds a footer to each slide. Okay. And so created in R will be added to each slide of this. So let me go ahead and knit that, and we'll give it just a little while to knit. If you, again, you're using a lot of code and output on your slides, I would recommend slidey over IO slides because you'll have less of an issue fitting it. Okay, so now you can see this is the slidey presentation. You'll see it looks somewhat like the presentation that we've been doing right now, but you'll notice that the slides, you can scroll up and down. Right? So now everything fits on one slide. And you'll notice at the bottom here is the footer created in R. Okay, so that is the slidey presentation. Okay. Any questions on the 2 presentations? Anything else? Okay, let's move on to LaTeX then. So a lot of people use R Markdown to make LaTeX documents. That's because LaTeX documents are a very pretty way of presenting your analysis or whatever you're doing in R Markdown. So for those of you that were able to get a tech distribution installed on your computer, this will work. If you did not do that, and you don't know, you don't think you have it installed, this may error and it may not compile correctly. For those of you that have one, you can try this. I want you to go ahead and replace the YAML header again, copy and paste the whole thing, and put it into the document. Okay. Now you'll see that the output format is PDF document, which is a LaTeX PDF. Okay. Now, the previewer actually for a LaTeX document is different from the previewer for an HTML. So if you'll notice it might look a little different. One of the nice things about LaTeX documents is the cable function makes really pretty tables. And I think I showed you one before, and I'll show you them again. But the tables in the LaTeX document are particularly nice looking. And it should be up any second. Yes. Okay, so this is the LaTeX previewer. It's a little different. And this is a LaTeX document. And it's kind of like a Word document, but LaTeX gives you a lot more control yourself over how to format it. And instead of buttons, it uses tags, just like Markdown or HTML. It uses tags to format the text. But here is a cable table, and you can see how nice that looks in LaTeX, even nicer than it does in HTML. So this is LaTeX is what I often use to create output documents for my clients that I do analysis for, and it's worked out really well for me. Okay, so some things to keep in mind. HTML that you put into your R Markdown file will actually be ignored when you compile it as a PDF document. All right, so you can actually just leave it in there. So let's say you want to have the same document in two formats. You want it to be both an HTML document and you want it to be a LaTeX PDF. Well, it turns out you can actually just leave the HTML in and you can leave the LaTeX in, and usually it's okay. Usually the other language will ignore the coding in, like HTML will ignore the LaTeX coding and LaTeX will ignore the HTML coding. So that works out pretty well. All right, but just know, yeah, if you have any raw HTML, LaTeX will just ignore it. And for those of you that don't know, and I was just trying to mention this kind of quickly over earlier, LaTeX itself is just another markup language to format text. So HTML uses those tags with less than and greater than. LaTeX tags look like this right here. And it's just several different languages that are used to format text. And Pandoc is what's used to convert one of these languages to another language. Okay. I'm not going to go over the actual LaTeX because not everybody knows it, but if you want to put actual LaTeX code in your document, you can. So for instance, if I wanted to make one of my headers red, I could, for instance, change this to this right here, this / color red. All of that is LaTeX coding. And then when I recompile my document, you'll see that the header background should appear now as a red text. So let's take a quick look. There it is, background in red. So you can also use raw LaTeX in your document to format things exactly as you want them. Now, keep in mind, though, that R Markdown was really made for HTML. And so things are generally easier to do in HTML than they are in LaTeX. All right. I want to go over these. I don't think I'm going to go over these. These are some more options for LaTeX. It still has the same table of context option and the highlight option. There's also a LaTeX engine option. Sorry, this should say LaTeX engine option that specify exactly which system of font that you want to use. But again, this all requires some LaTeX knowledge, so I'm not going to really go over it today. But there are more options you can use to specify the overall output for a LaTeX document. Okay. Just from my own experience, there are some challenges of working with LaTeX documents. You may especially find that images are placed where you didn't intend to, particularly if there are lots of consecutive images. And I did a lot of Google searching for help on this. And basically, the overall recommendation from the R Markdown people is that you first get all the content into your document first, then try to fine tune the placement of the images. Because let's say, you have a section with images and then another section with text and images after that. If you try to format the first section with the images first, then when you add the second section with the new text and images, that section can actually kind of screw up the previous section. So it all tries to format it all at once with all the sections together. And so it's better to put all the content in first, then try to fine tune the formatting and placement afterwards. Some troubleshooting advice: pay attention to the warnings and messages in the R Markdown console, not the regular R console. Okay, so when something bad happens, it will appear here in this R Markdown console and not in the regular R Studio console here. All right, so you won't usually see things go wrong here unless you're doing the notebook. So if you're doing notebook stuff like this, right? If you use one of these buttons and something is wrong here, then that error will often appear in this console. But if you knit and there's an error, the error will appear in the R Markdown console here. All right, so just be aware of that. Now, when you're running a so when you're compiling a document, when you're rendering it, make sure that document is closed. Sometimes R Markdown will just error, especially if you're doing LaTeX. Like, let's say you then actually physically open the file itself, like this PDF, right? So this is my PDF itself, and I'm viewing it in Microsoft's web browser. But you might, let's say, view it in Adobe Acrobat. Now, if you then try to render that file again, it will almost always error. So make sure it's closed. And make sure if you use Windows that you don't have it highlighted by the cursor. Because what Windows does is it often will create a preview, and that is considered an open file. And this vexed me so many times as I was trying to compile documents. So just make sure that you don't have a preview of that document open either. R Markdown will actually complete the rendering of the file. If your Markdown tags at the beginning of a line don't seem to be working, try adding a new line before the tags. So sometimes the tags get confused if there's a line right before it. So if they don't seem to be working, try adding a new line before the tags. And again, I highly recommend you edit your Markdown files in notebook mode and the interactive mode so that you can test code chunks one at a time rather than running the whole document every single time and then trying to find the error that way. At the end, I provided some resources for you for R Markdown. The R Markdown website itself is a good place to start just as an overview of what R Markdown can do. They do have some stuff you can read on here. The other thing I pointed out was the R Markdown Definitive Guide, which is that web book that I mentioned. And again, if you do plan to use R Markdown a lot, I would recommend that you probably just keep this tab open while you're working on it, because it is a great reference. It's written by the people that actually wrote R Markdown. Again, there's 2 cheat sheets from R Markdown available through RStudio. Again, if you go to Help, Cheat Sheet, there are 2. There's the R Markdown cheat sheet and the R Markdown reference guide. They contain a lot of the same information, actually. And then finally, there's the Knitter chunk options reference page. So specifically when you're wanting to alter the R code output or the graphical output, you probably go through these chunk options. Okay. So just to conclude, I hope you have found that R Markdown is easy enough to use with just a little experience. Just a little experience that you've got today would, I think, be enough for you to start creating these documents on your own. And it will give you a lot of flexibility to create reports in many different formats with really different appearances. And you can make really nice looking documents with just a little bit of effort. And as far as I can tell, you won't find a report generating system nearly as powerful as R Markdown in any other stat package that I know of. And this includes things like StatSASS or SPSS. You can go see the R Markdown website or the definitive guide to see even more uses of R Markdown. For instance, if you want to create a book or a blog page or an interactive document. And I believe that is all. Yes, that is the final slide. So are there any final questions that I can address?